Hi everyone, welcome to episode number 65 of Ask a Property Manager. Today is April 7th, 2021. We're coming to you from Studio 2.0 here at Own Buffalo. I'm Andrew Schultz, Principal Broker of Own Buffalo, Inc. And on today's show, we're going to be talking about New York State's plan to roll out some rent relief funds. We're going to look at a proposal to stop foreclosures until 2022, and we'll be answering some questions from housing providers around the country and so much more. Before we do that, we're going to plug our social media. New episodes of Ask a Property Manager drop every Wednesday at 10 a.m. Eastern, live on our Facebook page, facebook.com/Buffalo Foreclosed Homes. You can also find our replays live on our Facebook page as well as on our YouTube page. Those go up the same day that we record the live show, so those go up every Wednesday as well. Last but not least, don't forget about our Instagram page. A new episode of the Rent Prep for Landlords podcast also comes out this week. That will come out tomorrow on Thursday. This week, we're taking a look at how to handle tenants who are threatening legal action against you, informing new tenants of a criminal history against a property, against a previous property, basically. And we'll discuss if it's a good move to offer a discount to tenants who pay their rent early. So you don't want to miss out on that. New episodes of the Rent Prep for Landlords podcast drop every other Thursday. And you can catch that anywhere podcasts are heard or over at rentprep.com/podcast. We're going to jump right into our news of the day here, starting with this article coming out of CNBC. This was published on the 5th, which would have been Monday. Consumer protection groups propose rule to prevent foreclosures until 2022. The Consumer Finance Protection Bureau proposed a rule Monday to prevent a wave of foreclosures this fall when certain COVID-era protections for homeowners are set to expire. The proposal, which would need final approval, generally prohibits mortgage servicers from initiating foreclosure proceedings against delinquent borrowers until after December 31st, 2021. The rule would apply to all mortgages, both federal and private, on a principal residence, CFPB officials said on Monday. The COVID pandemic has led to a stark rise in housing insecurity amid mass unemployment and lost income, stressing homeowners' ability to pay monthly mortgages. The federal government let borrowers suspend payments as part of a forbearance program and placed moratorium on foreclosures. Forbearance doesn't forgive missed mortgage payments, it only defers them. Loans placed in forbearance programs early in the pandemic will reach the end of their forbearance period in September or October, the group said. As many as 1.7 million borrowers are expected to exit forbearance programs around that time and be at risk of foreclosure, a figure that dwarfs anything mortgage servicers have seen previous. CFPB Acting Director Dave Uyo, butchered that one, said on Monday. Such a foreclosure cliff would disproportionately impact Black, Hispanic, Native American, rural, and low-income homeowners, the group said. The CFPB is worried about a prospective cliff in the future, said Patricia McCoy, a professor at Boston College Law School and CFPB's former assistant director for mortgage markets. At some point, the cliff will happen, she said. Forbearance will go away and the foreclosure moratorium will go away, and 1.7 million borrowers are at instant risk of foreclosure. The consumer agency proposed establishing a temporary COVID-19 emergency pre-foreclosure review period. That's quite a mouthful, during which the mortgage servicers can't make an initial notice of foreclosure. This period would last through 2021. This comes on top of existing protections that disallows such a notice or filing until a borrower's loan obligation is more than 120 days delinquent. Many homeowners in forbearance are behind more than 120 days, said Diane Thompson, senior advisor to the acting director at CFPB. The proposal would give 3 months of breathing room for servicers to complete a loss mitigation review for borrowers, McCoy said. In such a review, mortgage servicers evaluate borrowers' financial situation and whether it makes sense to restructure their mortgage for more affordable payments or ultimately foreclose. I'm going to go ahead and highlight that because we're going to come back to that in a second. Modifying a mortgage could make sense if a delinquent homeowner who had lost their job has since regained employment at a lower pay scale and could afford monthly mortgage payments at a lower price point, McCoy said. That may increasingly apply to more homeowners if the job market continues to improve in the coming months, she said. Loss mitigation evaluations take time, and servicers may not be able to respond adequately without the proposed 3-month review period, she said. I don't think anyone has ever seen this many mortgages in forbearance at one time. They're expected to exit forbearance all at once. This could put an enormous strain on servicer capability. The proposal would also give some concessions to servicers. It would give servicers flexibility to offer certain streamlined loan modification options with less paperwork from borrowers if the restructuring meets certain guidelines. We'll come back to that in a second as well. The CFPB is also seriously considering and seeking comment on certain exemptions from the proposed free foreclosure review period if a servicer has completed a loss mitigation and the borrower is not eligible for any non-foreclosure options. It's also considering the exemption if the servicer has made efforts to contact the borrower and the borrower has not responded to outreach. Public comments on the rule are due by May 10th. So there's a couple of things that I wanted to touch on in this article. And the reason that I bring this article up is because we have been talking about the foreclosure moratoriums right along with the eviction moratoriums. And I look at the foreclosure moratorium as essentially another wave, just like the eviction moratorium. It's going to create its own self-fulfilling prophecy, a wave of evictions and a wave of foreclosures. The one thing that we have helping us across most of the country is historically low inventory is going to allow homeowners to potentially sell these properties before they have to go into a foreclosure situation if that's an option that's viable to them. And hopefully, based on the rising demand for properties, their sale price will cover the cost of whatever it is that they need to get out of the property. That's not going to happen in every instance for sure. But it is certainly something to consider when you're talking about, okay, does it make sense to foreclose or does it make sense to do a refinance? Let's scroll back down here. There we go. Do some sort of a refinance or a restructure of the mortgage to keep someone in their home. And again, when you have this built-in equity because the property values are increasing in your area, it makes it a lot easier for you to do some sort of a refinance or a restructure of your mortgage. So I think that this is probably the right move to have something in place whereby these loan servicers have to actually try to do a remod before they go through a full foreclosure proceeding. The other thing to keep in mind is, at least here in the state of New York, a full foreclosure proceeding takes somewhere between 24 months and 36 months. If we're being realistic, probably closer to 36, but sometimes if, the stars line up, you're closer to 24 months. Banks don't want to hold properties on their books for extended periods of time, which is what happens when they have to go through the foreclosure process. So anything a bank can do to prevent a foreclosure is in that bank's best interest, which is why you're going to see so many banks leaning so heavily on loan modifications and things of that nature to help these people get through these forbearance situations and kind of get things back on track. So I think that this is probably the right move as far as the foreclosure moratoriums go. The other thing I did want to point out, was up here at the top of the article, is that the rule would apply to all mortgages, federal and private, but only on principal residences. So this does not seem to offer a lot of protection for property investors who obviously are not living in every property that they own. So that might be something that you may still find yourself in a bind if you are in a forbearance and this is not a primary residence of yours. If it's an investment property or a second home or something like that, you could still find yourself in a bind. You'll probably see some of those properties wind up going through foreclosure. But this does give some sort of hope to those who are living in their primary residence, living in their principal residence, and just trying to figure out what the next steps are. So we'll see how this goes. We'll stay on top of this. This is obviously going to be a little bit before they do anything, as the public comments are not due until May 10th. So we're still looking at over a month before anything serious happens on this. But we'll keep watching this and bring you up to date as more develops. Our second article this week is with regards to New York State and the rollout of rent relief funds. This is a pretty interesting article. This one is written by The Real Deal, which is typically dealing more with downstate New York City, but this article seems to apply pretty much across the entire state. New York State close to approving $2.4 billion rent relief bill, but its rollout will be the real test. Landlord and tenant groups say the state's plan for distributing more than $2 billion in rent relief is a step in the right direction, though both have concerns about its rollout. The plan, spelled out in a newly printed bill, would bar evictions and rent increases for 1 year in cases where landlords accept aid. Both property owners and tenants can apply, but the program does not mandate that landlords accept the money, a point of concern for tenant groups. The bill does, however, require the Office of Temporary and Disability Assistance to repeatedly try to get an eligible landlord to cooperate. It gives property owners 180 days to accept before directing the funds to someone else. It also provides some protections against landlords who would rather drag tenants to court than accept federal aid. The measure states that a landlord who refuses to accept relief within 12 months has waived the unpaid rent and can't pursue a monetary action or judgment. Tenants are also able to use a landlord's lack of cooperation as a defense in court. The measure also allows tenants to self-attest to their eligibility through language, though language in the bill was vague. As of Tuesday, it indicated that federal and state regulations would determine what was possible. Aid can cover 12 months of arrears accrued on or after March 13, 2020, with an additional 3 months available only for rent-burdened households, i.e. those who dedicate 30% or more of their monthly income toward rent. C. Weaver, who heads the Housing Justice for All Coalition, said the bill includes many of her organization's priorities, including protections against evictions and explicit coverage for undocumented tenants. But the devil is where it always is, in the details, she added. Without a clear mandate for landlords to accept rent relief money, and until the program is up and rolling, it remains to be seen if it can meet the scale of the crisis. There we go. The program applies to households that have experienced financial hardship due to the pandemic, whether directly or indirectly. It first prioritizes tenants who make at or below 50% of the area median income, those with pending eviction cases, those who live in mobile homes, those who reside in a community disproportionately affected by the pandemic, are determined to be part of a vulnerable population, including victims of domestic violence and veterans, or who live in a building with 20 or fewer units, are all given preferential treatment and consideration. The measure also creates an initial 30-day window with its own hierarchy of priorities. For example, those making at or less than 50% of the AMI, who also belong to another priority group, are given a first crack at the funding. Further down the list are those earning 80% of the AMI and those who belong to another priority group. The group's implementation will largely depend on rules and regulations issued by OTDA. The previous state-run rent relief program was criticized for its slow rollout and failure to distribute all of the funds available. Of the $100 million available, the state only distributed $47 million. That's a failure. The remaining $53 million will be incorporated into the state's budget, according to Gothamist. A representative for the office did not immediately return a message seeking comment. The bar on evictions applies to holdover cases and instances where a lease has expired, although there is an exception for owners of properties with 4 or fewer units. They can opt to not renew a lease if they plan to personally occupy an apartment in the immediate future. Frank Rickey, Executive Vice President of the Rent Stabilization Association, said the bill doesn't specify if landlords can pursue evictions against tenants who are nuisances in the building. That's one of the carve-outs that's currently in the law that's basically being ignored. His organization is also concerned by the bar on rent increases, especially in stabilized apartments. He said it's too early to tell if these provisions would drive property owners to court instead of the state, but noted that legal action isn't often their first choice. Owners don't want to go to court, he said. They want to get paid. So there's a couple of things in here that I want to pull out of this article. Let's start with our highlighted stuff. The plan spelling out a newly printed bill, and I wanted to give everybody the bill information. This is A03006, and you can find this on the New York State Assembly website. This is the Assembly version of the bill. You can get the full text there. I've not yet had a chance to read through the full text of the bill. I'm going to be doing that, and we're actually probably going to wind up with a second video once we get some more information on this. And as things develop, I don't think that the bill is going to be quite the same as it is in its current form when it eventually passes. But I do want to start getting ahead of that so that we know what the situation is going to look like. So scrolling down a little bit, it provides some protection against landlords who would rather drag tenants to court rather than accept financial aid. The measure states that a landlord who refuses to accept rent relief within 12 months has waived the unpaid rent and can't pursue a monetary action or judgment. I don't see how that's legal, to be honest with you. I don't see how you can, from an outside perspective, because this lease is still between the landlord and the tenant, I don't see how you can make a determination that the landlord just doesn't get access to, or doesn't have the right to recuperate his funds simply because he won't accept federal aid, especially when that federal aid comes with its own set of strings and restrictions attached to it. So that's my thought on that. Tenants are also able to use a landlord's lack of cooperation as a defense in court. That makes sense. I think that there's already a carve-out in the law for that, so that didn't really surprise me too awful much. The measure allows tenants to self-attest to their eligibility, though language in the bill was vague. As of Tuesday, indicated that federal and state regulations would determine what is permissible. Be interesting to see how that pans out. When you start talking about tenants self-attesting to their eligibility, it's kind of the same thing as tenants self-attesting to the hardship declarations and things of that nature. How truthful are we really going to be? The flip side of that coin is if a tenant can self-attest and we don't have to go through all of the paperwork headache of the tenant submitting proof of income or lack thereof or whatever the situation may be, oftentimes we found that tenants simply don't have the paperwork that they need to make the application, which is why sometimes these applications are just going completely unhandled or, unapplied for, really. So that could be, either way. It's kind of hard to say. If the self-attestation means that the tenant doesn't have to supply a ton of paperwork and they can really get the ball rolling on this rollout, then I think I'm for that. It's just one of those things that, again, it even says in the article here that the language in the bill was vague. That's something that's going to need to be worked on a little bit before this passes. Aid can cover 12 months of rent arrears accrued on or after March 13th, 2020. For reference, today's April 7th, so we're already talking about 13 months in here. With an additional 3 months available only for rent burden households, i.e. those who dedicate 30% or more of their monthly income toward rent. Depending on what your income guidelines are for your apartments, you may not find yourself in a situation where your tenant even qualifies based on that. I know that when we use our criteria, we look for 3 times the rent in net income. So that's something that could have an impact. Anyway, going back to the heart of the matter, you're talking about a potential for 12 months of coverage plus 3 additional months only available to those who are rent burdened. Okay, that's great that you're going to possibly step up to the plate and pay out that 12 month. But what happens because you've now attached to this bill the landlord's inability to pursue an eviction for a year? What happens when that tenant just continues to not pay? Is there more relief that you're going to offer? Or are we now just right back in the same boat that we were and we're just kicking the can down the road for another year? That doesn't make sense to anybody either. The previous state-run rent relief program was criticized for its slow rollout and failure to distribute all of the funds available. Of the $100 million available, the state distributed only $47 million. That's 47% of the funds were distributed. 47%. That is a failure of a program. If you can't roll out the funds, it's a failure of the program. And this next line really hit me hard. The remaining $53 million will be incorporated into the state's budget. So the state just got a $53 million windfall to help close their budget gap. That's awesome. Too bad it doesn't help the tenants that need help. Too bad it doesn't help the landlords that need help. That one's really frustrating to me. I really have a problem with that particular section of the article. The bar on evictions applies to holdover cases and instances where a lease has expired, although there is an exception for owners of properties with 4 or fewer units. They can opt to not renew a lease if they plan to personally occupy an apartment in the immediate future. This I disagree with. If we're talking about non-payment, that's one thing. If you're talking about holdover cases, you may just need somebody out of an apartment. Maybe you want to update the apartment. Maybe you want the apartment vacant, whatever the case may be. Holdover cases are basically evictions tied to not to unpaid rent, but to the fact that someone remains living in a unit after their lease has expired. If you decide that you don't want someone living in your unit anymore and their lease has expired, I don't see why they should have any right to continue to remain in the property. It's pretty straightforward. Again, it boils down to this is a contract between landlord and tenant. The contract has expired. It's time for the tenant to move on to another unit or whatever the case may be. I've been saying for a while now that the moratorium on holdover evictions is bad for everybody for a variety of reasons. You can go back and watch last week's episode. We talked about it in depth in that episode. But I think that not hearing holdover cases and not hearing nuisance cases is really creating an even bigger wave of the self-fulfilling prophecy of the wave of evictions, if you will. So I think that we need to start hearing holdover cases, or at least start getting some of this stuff into mediation such that things can start moving forward here. Because right now, just bottlenecking everything is not doing anything to solve the problem. Let me see here. I want to find the part of the article that talked about the, let's see. Bear with me here. Okay, that's where it was. It was right in this first part here. Would bar evictions and rent increases for 1 year in cases where a landlord accepts the aid. So that is one thing I just wanted to touch on to wrap up again. If you were a landlord and you accepted this aid, you have to understand that there are strings attached to it. You know, if you're in a situation where this is going to keep you going, this is going to keep you alive, by all means get after it. But just understand that the money does come with terms and conditions attached to it. No rent increase and no eviction for a year. So if you have a tenant that, let's say we're now a full year in, and that tenant hasn't paid rent since March of last year. So they're gonna pay for all of that back rent, but you may or may not get that additional 3 months depending on what the status of your tenant's income is. And then on top of that, if the tenant continues to not pay rent, you are still stuck with that tenant for a full year. You're not going to be able to evict them. So it's something to think about. When money comes with terms and conditions attached to it, it certainly is a cause for concern. And then when you tell landlords that we're going to put these terms and conditions against this money for you to accept it, and if you don't accept it, then you just don't get to accept, then you don't get your money at all, that's hot garbage in my opinion. So hopefully this gets ironed out a little bit better before it ultimately does get passed. I think it's a step in the right direction, but I think that there are still some pretty severe issues here that need to be addressed before things get passed. And again, I'll provide that Assembly bill. This is New York State Assembly Bill A03006. C, I believe, is actually the current version of it. So you can find that right on the State Assembly's website. And you can get that information and review it at your leisure. Let's jump into a couple things that are a little bit more humorous to kind of change the mood here. I don't know if I've posted this one before or not, but it always makes me laugh, especially given the current state of the real estate market. Things are so crazy out there right now that you might find yourself in a situation like that. So I thought that was pretty funny and I wanted to share it. Then we have this. We recently moved. I moved a couple weeks ago. And there's been a multitude of little things that have just needed attention around the house since we moved. And this is how I feel every single time I fix something. So I'm sure that there are a lot of landlords and housing providers out there that feel the exact same way. I just think it's pretty funny to see something like that. So let's go ahead and jump into our questions from housing providers around the country. We're going to start with this one on utility rollover agreements. The electric company is suggesting I put a landlord agreement in place, but I'm not sure if it's the best practice. Essentially, if a tenant notifies the electric service that they're moving out, the service automatically reverts to my name without me notifying them. So this is a double-edged sword. I'll start by saying that we're in a cold weather climate here in Buffalo, New York. So having this sort of a thing in place can be literally the difference between having heat on in a vacant apartment and having thousands of dollars in damage due to frozen pipes. So that's certainly something to consider if you're in a cold weather climate, where you might be in a situation where you wind up with property damage or frozen pipes as a result of the property sitting vacant and without utilities. At least in our area here, the utility companies, the gas company and the electric company both offer this program. It's called Leave On for Landlord, both with National Grid and National Fuel. And you can find the information for that on their website or by giving them a call. The one thing that is worth noting is that if a utility is shut off for non-payment, it does not automatically roll over to the landlord. The utility company will actually go off and perform a physical shutdown of the utility, and it won't automatically roll over if it's a non-payment issue. So the flip side to that coin is if the tenant shuts off the utility and it does roll over to you, you may not be able to turn that utility off without it being considered the start of a constructive eviction. I'm not an attorney. I've spoken to attorneys on this, and general consensus is you could find yourself in a situation where if you turned off a utility because it reverted back to you, even if it's a tenant responsible item to pay for that utility, once it's in your name, you might be stuck paying for it. So my thought process on that is I think I would rather pay a utility bill than wind up with frozen pipes or something like that from just not having an electric or gas service at a property. That's kind of my take on it. I've seen it both ways. I know that here in our office, we will typically encourage landlords to get enrolled in the Leave On for Landlord programs, and most of them do go for that option simply because it makes sense. But there is a flip side to that, and you could get caught with a tenant that's not paying your utilities, which just leads to more and more headache. So there's a couple things that you can do to try to combat this. Number one, on your move-in checklist, the first thing that you should do, not the first thing you should do, but one of the things that you should do before a tenant moves in, we actually do this the morning of the move-in, is we call the gas and electric company and double check to make sure that the utility has been rolled out of the housing owner's name and over to the tenant's name. If it hasn't, we don't complete the move-in. It's that simple. If you don't establish the utilities in your name, you cannot take possession of the apartment until those utilities are in your name. And we've had tenants that have failed to do that, and we've had to bump their move-in dates back. And they get real bent out of shape, but they didn't follow the instructions on the front end, which is why they find themselves in that position. So making sure that your tenants actually follow that and move those utilities into their name is going to be super important. And making sure that it's done before they even move in is going to help you solve a lot of headaches right away. Not a bad idea to make sure that the tenants switch everything over to their names prior to move-in. So the other thing that I would mention is that, again, both the gas and electric company do offer this program, at least here in Western New York. I'm pretty sure most utility providers at this point are offering something similar. Contact them, find out what the ins and outs are of the program in your area, and see if it's something that would make sense for you. My recommendation would be strongly consider this if you're in a cold weather climate or someplace where you're going to find yourself causing property damage by not having those utilities in place. Let's jump to question number 2, maybe. There we go. Short-term relocation tenants. Does anyone have any advice or warnings or potential gotchas for working with a relocation or insurance company that tries to place tenants due to catastrophes in their homes? We've done this a few times and it's worked out great every single time. We've never had an issue. Generally speaking, they're looking for a shorter-term lease, usually like a 6-month lease or something like that. But oftentimes they are flexible. So if a 6-month lease is going to drop you right in the middle of winter, you can probably get them to extend that lease out for a couple of months to put you back into a decent season for rentals. The other thing is you're going to get a premium on your rent because they're asking for that short-term lease. They're going to offer you a premium on your rent. And it's negotiable. So if you don't think that you're getting a high enough premium, you might actually be able to push and get some more. The one thing I would mention is that they are short-term leases, but we've never had one of these leases end when it was supposed to end. So what generally happens is, we'll use the example of the most recent one we had, which was, I believe, a fire relocation. They had a fire in their home. They needed some place to stay while their home was being rebuilt. And it was supposed to be a 6-month lease. I knew right off the bat that they were not going to have that home done in 6 months. So in my head, I'm already thinking this is probably going to be a 9-month to 12-month lease. And it wound up being at least, I think it was over 12 months when all was said and done. But we got that premium every single month regardless. So it worked out super, super well. We never had a late rent payment. We never had a missed rent payment because it comes directly from the relocation company or the insurance company. Never had any concerns that way. Screen the tenants the same as you would any other tenant. Follow all of your normal move-in procedures. Read through the paperwork carefully that you get sent by the relocation company or by the insurance company to see if there's any loopholes or anything crazy in there, any hangups or something like that. But generally speaking, these are a pretty straightforward contract. It's, the landlord and the tenant with a third-party payee. It's almost similar to a Section 8 contract, to be honest with you, just with a lot less restrictions and things of that nature and with a premium coming in on the rent. So these are actually pretty good scenarios. If you find yourself in a situation where someone is in need of emergency housing and their insurance company is picking up the tab, it certainly is worth exploring. I would definitely recommend digging into that a little bit further. Let's jump to question 3. Who mows the lawn? Hello, landlords. I'm new to landlording, but I have other real estate investing experience. I have a house on a city lot smaller than 0.25 acres, but the yard needs to be mowed throughout the year. I would like the tenant to mow the yard, so any thoughts or recommendations on mowers? I'm currently thinking of a battery-operated push mower, so tenants don't have to mess with gas and oil. Thank you. So this is one of those things that needs to be specified in your lease. For our single-family units, our leases state that the tenant is responsible for landscaping and lawn care, as well as for snow removal. In our multifamily properties, we take care of that stuff. So for our singles, we do not provide any sort of lawn maintenance equipment. That's on the tenant to provide that equipment. It's right in the lease that they're responsible for the lawn care and the landscaping and any of the, associated costs, whether that be a lawnmower or gas or whatever the case may be. It's on the tenant. It's up to them. It helps to reduce our liability by not providing them with a piece of lawn equipment, which may not get maintained properly, or, tenant does something stupid, like turns a push mower over on its side and starts chucking beer cans into the moving blades. Yes, I've seen it. Wasn't a tenant, though. It was in college. But yeah, there's a lot of things that could go wrong if you're providing the equipment. I would recommend not providing the equipment for that reason. We also offer tenants, because we're already providing the service on our multifamily properties, we offer tenants in our single family units the ability to sign on with our lawn service. And then what we do is just bump the rent up to make sure that there's compensation for that. That's actually a pretty good option if you are already doing something with other properties. Give the tenant the option. It might turn into a little bit of a profit center for you. If the tenants are responsible for the lawn care and the landscaping, you do need to check to be sure that it is actually getting completed. Otherwise, you're going to get fined by whatever municipality. It happens all the time where tenants don't get a chance to mow the lawn for a couple of weeks. It gets long, a neighbor complains, and before you know it, the town is out there writing a ticket for a lawn that needs to be cut. Now you have a fine in addition to having a lawn that needs to be cut. So I guess ultimately, if you want it done the way you want it done, you should handle it and include it in the rent. If it's something where you think the tenants are going to be capable of handling it and you don't want that responsibility, push it back on the tenants. Either way, it needs to be specified in your lease, and make sure who's responsible for both the equipment and for the actual lawn and landscaping and stuff like that. So that's how I would handle that situation. If it's a multi, we automatically include it. If it's a single, we do put that responsibility back on the tenants. That pretty much wraps things up for this week's episode of Ask a Property Manager. Thank you all so much for joining us. We truly do appreciate it. We love producing Ask a Property Manager, and you can definitely help us to improve. Drop a question in the comments either on Facebook or YouTube, and your question may be answered in an upcoming episode. If you enjoyed this content, or if we brought some value to your day, do us a favor and hit that thumbs up button. YouTube and Facebook both push videos based on community feedback. Excuse me. So every like, comment, subscribe, and share helps us to grow and reach more people. We'll be back next week on Wednesday, April 14th at 10 a.m. with another 10 a.m. Eastern with another episode you won't want to miss. Thank you all so much for watching, and we'll see you next week.